she a dancer. Little shorty a dancer. When I throw that fucking money, she put her hands up. Hey, she a dancer.
Your pro. He's a master teacher. All right, and I think that when you leave here tonight, or when he finishes lecturing, I think that your feeling about what he has to say will probably just be as ecstatic as the brothers and sisters uptown. So he is a professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. He has written several books. The African presidents in early Europe, the African presidents in early Asia, Blacks in Science that came before Columbus. Several books about our African heritage. He's a man who is well known amongst our people, well known in the activist community, and he's one of those persons that has a mind almost like a well. You dip down in it, and every time that you come back up, you come up with some fresh, clean water. That's the type of mind that this brother has. And so without further ado, and with great honor, I'd like to present you to our featured speaker for this evening, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Tape recorders, we would appreciate it if you would respect our restriction of not taping the program, because we're selling things here. All right, you can purchase one at the end of the program for $5. Thank you.
Okay. I was asked today on the Gary Bird show what led me to the creation of They Came Before Columbus. I think the incident that led me to this is perhaps one of the most remarkable incidents in my life. I do not think I'm by nature superstitious, but I have noticed during the process of my life certain extraordinary coincidences which, when studied carefully over many years, impress one not as coincidence at all, but as acts of fate. Because I do distinctly remember that I had no right to come to America. I had not the slightest idea I would come here. It was a pure accident. I was unemployed in England. I had left the university. I found it utterly impossible to get a job. And I was working on a novel. I had been doing for a while literary criticism. And I'd been working on a novel, and I had worked on novels before, and then I went into the university. I finished my degree, and I came out, and I found myself still working on a novel because there was nothing else to do. I had studied, I had made careful study of African societies, etc., not major studies in civilization, not at that time, and I did not know what to do with my degree because nobody would employ me. So there I was, all alone in London, and I was invited by my Prime Minister, along with other writers and poets, to come to witness the independence celebration in Guyana. So I got in a plane. It was all paid for, and I was flown, and it was to be one great week in which I would see my friends again. I had not seen them for many years, and my family, and that would be it. But as I was coming out, I was just about to leave Guyana to go back to London and emptiness. A friend of mine said to me, "Why don't you come over to New York and then come on to Princeton?" And I said, "I can't come to New York. I don't have a penny." And he said, "You don't need a penny because your plane has to land in New York anyway, and you could land in New York and then catch the plane the day later or a few days later. It's the same thing." So I said, "But I don't have any money to go from New York to Princeton." And he said, "Well, I'll lend you some money." So he made out a check for $7-something. It was a traveler's check, but he forgot to sign it. So when I got into Port Authority in New York, I found I could go no further because I did not have a penny. It was as rough as that. At that time, I was earning 7 guineas a week from broadcasting, which is about $14 a week. I lived on about $14 a week. That included food, clothes, rent, everything. And I utterly stranded, and I was arguing with the port authority, could you let me on this bus, please? When I get to the other end, my friend will pay the fare. And they said, no, we can't do anything like that. And some old woman heard me making this plea, and she gave me $3, and that's how I got into New Jersey. And the next morning, I got up and I was going through the library of my friend at Princeton and found to my astonishment 3 books. These books looked as if they had never been read for years. They were called Africa and the Discovery of America by Leo Wiener. This was a man working completely on his own, a linguist, a great linguist, in the 1920s at Harvard. And he had been asked, he had no intention, just like me, pure accident, he had no intention of working on this subject. He had been asked, since he knew many languages, including Arabic and Russian and French and Spanish and you name it, he knew quite a number of languages, and he had been asked to prepare a primer of American languages. And as he was doing this, he began to discover words that did not make sense in terms of that language. It had endings that were not correct, or forms that did not seem to be native, that is, it did not spring from those languages. And when he began to check this out, he discovered to his astonishment all of these words were coming out of a certain area in Africa along the Atlantic coast. And he checked etymologies and dictionaries, and he found, yes, this is very strange. Here are some words for various fruits in South America. Here are some words for various garments and other things and various rituals in Mexico, and they are African words, or they're very close, so close that it doesn't make sense not to link them up. So he began pursuing this, and he wrote these books about rituals, linguistic links, and various things. However, what puzzled me was that while some of this was extremely persuasive and convincing, it left me feeling that he hadn't proven his case. Half the time he had to guess and plunge in the dark, because no great archaeology, no serious archaeology had yet been done in the 1920s. So I left that weekend. That's all. I only had 2 days to look at these books, and I left and I went back to London, and I forgot all about it because I couldn't pursue it any further. It intrigued me, but I couldn't pursue it any further. And then about a month later, somebody called me on the phone and said, we would like you to come back. We want you to take a job at Rutgers University. We're forming a Black Studies program. Would you teach Swahili literature? I had been trained in Swahili and Bantu languages, etc. So I said, yes, I would do that. And I came back here. And as soon as I came back, I looked for those books. And I started looking and looking very closely at those books, and I wrote a critique. Now, the strange thing about that critique, as I have said, is that when I wrote it, I had no intention of going any further. I had checked all the references I could check, and I wrote saying I was not convinced. It was intriguing, it was persuasive in many respects, but it was not total proof that Africans were in America before Columbus. So I actually began by criticizing this thesis, not by accepting it. My scholarly approach to the subject was such that I would not take anything for granted unless it was proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. So I wrote an article about it, and I sent it to Random House. They were publishing a magazine called Amistad, and they were about to publish Amistad 2. Fortunately, they never did publish that. And the same day this article I wrote, this critique I wrote, landed on the desk of this editor, Charles Harris, at Random House. The very same day, a black novelist who'd written The Man Who Cried I Am, John Williams, had been to Mexico, had written an article of an interview he had with von Wutenow in Mexico, and my article ended, if anyone could show me just a handful of heads, sculptures in America with African faces, then I would begin to believe. And on the very next page after that question, there were photographs John Williams had brought back from Mexico, from von Wuthenau's studio, with these terracottas, that is, clay sculptures of Africans. Now that was the beginning of something entirely new for me, because that told me something. It said I had thrown a question out into time and space, and somewhere life had brought an answer back. And it was a signal. It wasn't enough, because von Wuthenau is not a trained anthropologist, and von Wuthenau, although he had picked up these terracottas from various places, etc., had built up some kind of a case, but not a case that had a kind of very logical sequence. It was drawn from various periods, etc. So even though he showed that there must have been a physical presence of Africans, that was not enough. What did these Africans do? When really did they come here? Where did they come from exactly? What were they doing here? Did they go back home? Did they have any influence on the people, or were they just there and that's it? Because there were other presences in America, therefore that was not enough. So I began laboriously over the years to check out all the various things in which people had made discoveries. I began to look again at all the people who had claimed things in America that had similarity with things in Africa, etc. A lot of it was nonsense, because similarity is a very, very dangerous thing. If you find a fish hook in Egypt and you find a fish hook in America, there is no relationship, because it's very easy to make a fish hook. Nobody told me to make a fish hook. I lived on a river for 14 years and I made fish hooks. So that it cannot be simple. It has to be very complex, it has to be very unique, and you have to have proof that nobody did it before. So that it's a very, very difficult field. You can't just pick up similarity in place A and similarity in place B and says, yes, there is an influence, because the Americans were living here for thousands and thousands of years. They'd come across the Bering Straits about 50,000 or 20,000 years ago. There were 2 ice ages, and therefore they could have done all sorts of things. Therefore you had to find things that you could establish beyond the shadow of a doubt had never occurred in America before, that was very complex, very unique, and for which there was an antecedence or beforeness in the African world before one found it in archaeological strata or layer in the American world. Now then the one thing that struck me with great force is that you cannot recover American history or African history in the same way in which you recover European history. Europe has had the advantage, because of her conquests, of having an almost unbroken continuity in certain respects. She has what I call an archival continuity. Archives are libraries. If you want to find out anything that happened in 1492, you go to a library in Europe. For Europe, that is possible. But what happened to Africa and America isn't like a shattering and an explosion. In order to find out what happened to the shuttle, when the shuttle went up and it blew up, they had to go and track everything they could find on the floor of the Atlantic. They had to look at every little fragment. They had to fit pieces together. They had to take them into the laboratories. It took them months before they could say with an absoluteness, it was the seal, it was the seal, it was the seal. They had to check everything. They had to check the cabin, the disintegration of the bodies, the booster rocket and everything. That is what has happened to Africa. What Europe did to us is like dropping a bomb that blew us to pieces all over the place. And it is necessary to pull the fragments together in order to see what Africa was before it exploded. And when one can do that, one can do 2 things. One can take out of the broken, fragmented world which one now inhabits, one can find a new wholeness. And one can, by putting those pieces together, make it impossible for anyone to blow us up again in the way they did before. A different kind A different kind of world, a different kind of mind, a different kind of consciousness comes into being. And one is not talking because one likes to talk nice things. One is saying this because history has shown this. This has happened to other people, the Jews, for example. I have been in streets in Europe where they took Jews up and threw them in the river like garbage in the Danube. The Jew is not powerful today by accident, and I'm not saying that one approves the various methods that people who have once been down on the ground seizing power take, because that is very unfortunate that Israelis now behave with such an arrogance and such a disregard for the past that all they're concerned about is what happened to us. And yet the people who have suffered as they have suffered are thrust into the dust. I don't want to go into that any further. One can say a lot about that. But I want to make it quite clear that in history there have been many, many stories of people who have been fragmented like this, who have had their world shattered like this, and who've been able to build again a new nation, a new consciousness. Hence, when we go back into history, we are not just doing this to accumulate new data. We are doing this with a serious political and psychological purpose. We are doing this in order to build a new nation. Take Columbus. Columbus was the first person, not I or Waina, to suggest there were Africans in America before him. He actually says so in one of his diaries, the diary of the second voyage. Columbus said that when he was in the Caribbean, in a place then called Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Santo Domingo, natives of those islands came to him and told him that blacks had come from the south and southeast with gold-tipped metal spears. Now I want you to note this fact. Look at that. If that had happened in Europe, there would be no question. It would go into a book, it would be in a library, and everybody could come back and say, here's the proof. This has been established. In fact, it is in a library. It is there in the diaries of Columbus, but it is not accepted because the reason is that black people were considered by that time, having the slave trade begun, black people were not considered to be anything after these facts were being examined years later. Blacks had already lost their power, and therefore it did not make sense that they could have boats that could cross the Atlantic. Hence all of that was thrust onto the rug. But look at it carefully. The question may arise, who are these people, these dark-skinned people from the south and southeast? And some people have said, yes, those could be dark-skinned Indians living in the equatorial regions. But it didn't stop there. Columbus actually had these spears, these gold-tipped metal spears. He actually had samples sent back on boats, mail boats to Spain. And the Spanish metallurgists looked closely, inspected these spears, and found that they had the same ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as spears then being forged in African Guinea. So first of all, the Americans said so. Secondly, the metallurgists say it is African. Thirdly, Leo Wiener discovered that guanin is what the Americans were calling the spears, because Columbus said that's what they were calling it, and it comes from guani. It is just have the final consonant end to bring it into the language. It comes from guani, which means gold, and which is used for those spears. And thirdly and fourthly, there is evidence that comes from the Portuguese documents that blacks, Africans, were leaving the Cape Verde Islands, which is just off the coast of Africa, and going far to the west with merchandise in large boats. And then oceanography shows us that if you go off the Cape Verde and you go in a boat, you have to come to America. It takes you right into the Caribbean towards those islands where they were trading, and there's a current that spins off Africa and brings you right back spins off Florida, and brings you right back into the African Atlantic coast. And then furthermore, botany shows us that Europeans settling in the Cape Verde 30 years before Columbus in 1466 introduced a cotton, Gossypium hirsutum var punctatum, a variety of American cotton, into the Cape Verde. Now, how could an American cotton get into the Cape Verde 30 years before Columbus? This is the very place where the boats are leaving, and an American thing has got into Africa before Columbus. This is not a cotton that is African. In fact, these Portuguese who had entered since 1450 they discovered this cotton growing plentifully on the Atlantic coast of Africa, thinking it was African, took some of it and planted it into the Cape Verde as they settled there. And when botanists studied it, they found it was not African, it is American. So if you go to botany, you go to metallurgy, you go to the Portuguese documents, you go to Columbus's diary, you go to linguistics, they all bear out the case. In Europe, you do not have to do this. We have got to do this. We have got to develop teams. We have got to enter several disciplines in order to recover our history, because it's all shattered and fragmented. It is not a simple matter, but what makes it quite clear is that it still exists. We have not lost the critical elements of that history. We are now in a position to recover those things. But far more serious, far more important than what happened in the late pre-Columbian, which is between 1450 and 1500, that is a trade between West Africans and people in the Caribbean. Something far more serious happened in America. I'm not talking about just before Columbus. I am talking now about America before Christ. They have found irrefutable evidence of an African presence here among the Native Americans before Christ. Let me discuss that evidence. In 1858, more than 100 years ago, Mexican peasants were wandering about in a village called Tres Zapotes. They discovered a stone head. This stone head weighed about 10 tons. It had unmistakable African features: broad nose, full lips, the structure that you associate with the African face, and a helmet. Now, because of the helmet, the hair did not show, therefore you couldn't say conclusively. You could say, okay, it looks like an African, but people could say, but there are some Asiatics who look like Africans. After all, Africans went into Asia and mutated. Africans went to Europe and mutated. So you could say, suppose that's an Afro-Asiatic type. There are Asians who look like Africans, and there are Asians who look like Europeans, because you have that kind of mixing and melting in Asia. So how can you swear it is an African? But in 1862, note this. This is not even they came before Columbus. In 1862, they found a head in Mexico. It is now in the canton of Tuxtla. This head not only has African features, it has 7 braids. It has 7 braids. No figure in American history, in the history of American sculpture, no American ever had a 7-braided hairstyle. In other words, it's not only the nose, it's not only the mouth, it's not only the brow ridge, it's not only the jaw, the hair, which is one of the unmistakable distinctions between the Mongoloid type and the Africoid type and the European type, that was found on the stone head. Do you know that head has never, that photograph has never been published? I published it in the fall. In fact, it did not come out in the fall. In the spring, in the winter of 1985, that head was published for the first time. Do you know where we found it? Lying untouched and unpublicized in a file in the Smithsonian. All these are masters and experts of ancient Mexico, like Michael Coe, etc., never published that head. And then they went on in that early stage, Mexicans like Jose Melgar, Roscoe Bear, etc., Nicolas Leon, Riva Palacio, these people wrote about Africans in America before Columbus. Palacio made a fool of himself because he said that this probably happened when the continents were joined. That's absolute rubbish. There were no human beings. There weren't even apes when the continents were joined. That is long, long back in geological time. That has nothing to do with the development of humanity and culture. Okay? These things happened within fairly recent times. When I say recent, modern man goes back about 100,000 years. I pointed out in Gary Bird's show today, and I want to repeat it here. It has now been established scientifically from the most conservative establishment in the world, Oxford, that modern man is African. In other words, it is not only was man born in Africa, everybody accepted that for some time. Not only was man born in Africa, but the most advanced type of man at his present state of evolution, occurred in Africa. They have now found evidence of that he then moved up into Europe, and he moved up into Asia, and he mutated into European type man and Asiatic man. In other words, they have established now, through the study of blood and DNA, they have established now that all peoples have African ancestors. And I'm not talking about primitive ape man. I'm talking about modern man with the modern brain case of man. In other words, there are no creatures on this, there are no humans on this earth. 90,000 years ago, there are no humans on the earth who are not black. The white man, that is European man, does not come into existence until about 50,000 years ago. Some people put it, the breakaway, a little later, 30,000, but we could safely put it now at about 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, then, there are no men on the earth who are not black. Okay, all man is African. In other words, the brain case, and this is very important because people have argued it's not enough to say man was born in Africa. That doesn't mean anything. Man being born in Africa doesn't make African man equal with European man, okay? Let me explain that. It has been argued that although man was born in Africa, he was very primitive, very backward, did not have a proper brain. And when he came to Europe, he evolved an advanced proper man. In other words, European man is complete man. What this scientific study, which in fact was not released until February of this year, one day before Diop's death, what this scientific study shows is not just primitive man like Homo erectus and Australopithecus robustus and Australopithecus gracile and Homo habilis and all those types. Modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, modern man, man with the brain case that we all have now, is African. And all other non-African populations spring from that final man. Okay, that is very important. It is important not only in the study of the early history of man, it is important because that man was to move into Egypt, he was to move into Ethiopia, he was to move up into Egypt. When we talk about what happened in America, therefore, before Christ, we are talking about the influence of a major African population. I'm not talking about the beginnings of man now, that's 90,000 years ago. I am talking about the movement of civilized man, advanced man, man with an Egyptian civilization, Nubian civilization, man who came very recently, only about 3,000 years ago. Okay, so I want you to understand, separate those two things. We're not talking about the beginnings of man, because I've dealt with that separately. I wanted you to know that because I want you to know the distinction between what has recently been found establishing modern man is African and all modern man has African ancestors, to something that occurs thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. What we found in America is astonishing. It's not only that we found heads with African features, we found heads that were, some of them weighed as much as 40 tons, one head, 40 tons, carved out with tremendous skill. Carved out with tremendous skill. And in addition to those stone heads, we found so far about 14. Last week they found 2 more. They're still finding more. The archaeology of America is not finished. They have only scratched the surface. They have found more than 100 terracottas. That is clay sculptures. Those of you who come with us to Mexico on this trip, and those of you who want to know more about it, Dorothy Anderson is here tonight. She's organizing that trip, and I am the major lecturer. We go to major historic sites in Mexico. We go to the Great Pyramid at Teotihuacan in Mexico City. We go on to we will also look at the Von Wutenau collection, because there you have the finest collection of terracotta with African features in the world. There you have evidence through all the periods pre-Columbian of an African presence. Not only are they African in terms of their noses, lips, etc., brow ridge, jaw, etc., texture of hair. On the stone heads, there is only 1 or 2 where you could see the hair because they're covered by military-type helmets. But in the terracotta, where you do not have these helmets, you can look at the texture of hair. And also, an oxide dye is being used in the clay in order to evoke the coloration of the skin. You can't escape it. It's as Diop said when he was in Senegal last year, just a few months before he died. Whenever they find a white man, there's no problem. They find a nation, there's no, but when they find a black man, we are not sure. They don't know who a black man is. We have always been classified, you know, when you go to South Africa, they know very well who a black man is. But as soon as they find him where they shouldn't be found, they don't know who a black man is. When they were at the conference in 1974 in Cairo, do you know how many people tried to argue there's no such thing as race after they have classified us? After they've shown that we had nothing to do with civilization, when at last Obenga and Diop faced them, and only the Africans did their homework. You know, UNESCO was so embarrassed they had to note in the report, they said the debate was unbalanced because the other participants did not have as well researched contributions as Diop and Obenga. Who told them not to prepare? They didn't even have to. You see, these guys thought that we would sit back all our lives for the next few centuries not learning anything. But when we got a chance, we learned. And we learned every damn thing because we had to learn. When I faced some of these critics of mine in Arizona, I blasted them into hell because I suddenly realized these guys do not have our equipment. Because they got it so easy, they only had to say, so and so is so. I can't say that, I have to prove it. Hence, I had to learn my stuff well. Diop also had to learn his stuff well. It took him 10 years before they would accept his doctorate. He had to get a battery of people before they would accept his doctorate. Because he couldn't say something, he had to prove it against the centuries of scholars. But these guys had it easy. So when at last they met real Africans, Africans with the classical ability of the early Egyptians, men like Diop and Obenga, then they met their match. And then when they found they couldn't, one guy got up and said, and note this guy is from the United Arab Republic of Egypt. He said there were no people no Negroes, quote unquote, that's his word, no Negroes in the world until the Neolithic stage. That's the age of agriculture. Everybody was Caucasian. The Negroes came later. And then Diop showed that he was a fool. And then somebody got up and said something else, and Diop smashed him down. And then the others say, let's not talk about race. Mokhtar, Gamal Abdel Mokhtar, he said race is unimportant. And then another guy said, Saf Soderbergh said, it is quite clear that the language is African. It is quite clear that the culture is African. It is quite clear that the techno-complex is African. But we mustn't talk about race. Well, are they white Africans? And Shinny from Canada, he said, you must be very careful that when Herodotus, the Greeks, and other Greeks said that the Egyptians were black, they were just being subjective like Diop. They didn't know what they were talking about. They were probably dark like Italians. Note what was happening there. These people, for the first time, all the time they had it to themselves, they could declare that they were dealing with Caucasoid. They said how the pyramids were built. Our race of pyramid builders, Libico-Asiatic, entered. Where are their pyramids? They're a race of pyramid builders. They must have been building pyramids for thousands of years to start coming in here among the Africans to build pyramids. All of these silly statements which could have been made for centuries without support. Now it is impossible. There is too much embarrassment. Nobody could make any more easily the statements they made before, because the rot has to stop. We are going to make a stand now, and we are going to prove every damn thing, because science is on our side. They have found skeletons. Now they're saying skeletal evidence. When they were using it against us to show this is the Caucasoid skeleton and this is the Negroid, and they define who's the Negroid and who is the Caucasoid. Now that we're showing, well, okay, we take your definition. Look here, there are Negroes, as you call them here in America. Look, they have the depressed nasal ridge and the platyrrhini and all of these things that you talk about, the classical Negroes. No. Skeletal evidence is doubtful. Wierzyński, working in a school, the Krakow school, the school in Eastern Europe and in Russia, when it comes to paleontology, you can't beat the Russians. The Russians can reconstruct. If you give them half a skull, they could reconstruct the whole skull with computer-like precision. The Russians are the only people at the moment who have recovered the secret of mummification. From Lenin right through, they are preserved. All the Russian leaders who died, you could see them in the 21st century. They are mummified like the Egyptians. When our president died a few months ago, in Guyana, we sent him to Russia to be mummified. Unfortunately, our refrigeration unit broke down. So by the time he got to Russia, there wasn't much to mummify. The Russians had to burn him. As I said before, it depends on your politics whether that's a tragedy or not. But it is important to note that Wierzyński, the Polish craniologist, discovered as much as 13.5% of the skeletons in the dry areas of the Olmec were a place like Tatilko were African. In other words, and this was not among the general population, this is the ruling class, what is known as the priest caste. This a major minority, a significant minority of the ruling class was African. In other words, even though you had a few Africans coming in, they were significant, they were not general. Just scattered in the general population, they had significant roles. Major monuments were built to them. And when we look, we can look beyond mere physical evidence like stone heads, terracotta skeletons. Look at the stylistic things that began to appear. Take the plumed serpent. Nobody had the plumed serpent. The plumed serpent is the bird and the serpent. Okay, you look on the diadems and crowns of the ancient Egyptians and you're going to see a bird and a serpent. You come to America after this contact between Afro-Egyptians and Americans, and you're going to find the American moves away from his jaguar and he has a plumed serpent. You can actually go to one of the temples of Quetzalcoatl. Quetzal means plume, Coatl means serpent, plumed serpent in Mexico. And you will find at one stage the jaguar, which was the main motif of the Olmec, the first civilization in America, Olmec. You can find that that jaguar, his tail is becoming a serpent, and instead of having the normal wool on his coat, it turns to feathers. You can look at the pyramids. It is true that the Americans kept building pyramids long after the Egyptians, after they got the first start, but the first pyramid to appear in America appears on the same platform, a place called La Venta, where they found 4 of the stone heads and were able to date them. Do you know what the carbon dating was at that platform? 814 plus or minus 134 BC. That is between 948 to 680 years before Christ. You have the African presence. And the very first pyramid appears, both the true pyramid as well as the step pyramid that appeared in Egypt. And when the greatest of all pyramids in Mexico appear at Teotihuacan, you will find that the measurements are the same. The sacred numbers that have gone into the development of pyramids in Egypt, those sacred numbers are being used in varying degrees in Mexico. Now, I cannot speak for long tonight, but let me close by mentioning certain things that are absolutely important. Scripts. In my book, there is no mention of scripts because nothing was known of it at that time. While I was writing that, a man named Barry Fell was writing about scripts. And he shows Egyptian scripts appeared in America. The Micmac, a branch of the Algonquians, were found to be using Egyptian scripts. They said Father Maillard, the Jesuit priest, brought these scripts to them, and then Barry Fell showed that Champollion had not yet deciphered the Egyptian script, so how could Maillard bring it to them? They would not know what it means. The very symbols with the same sound and the same meaning are there. He showed the Phoenician, which was a critical element among the Egyptians and the Nubians at that time, have been found in America. Many rituals, all the traits of the kings, the flail, the royal parasol, feathered sunshades with the same 3 concentric circles, the same colors, the use of purple as a sign of royalty, the double crown, which is found nowhere in the world, things unique, things complex, paper made from wood pulp, appearing nowhere in the world except Egypt. The technical process turns up here in America. How come? If in addition to all these physical pieces of evidence, stone heads, terracotta skeletons, you find stylistic parallels that are complex and unique and have no antecedents in America, occurring for the first time here as they occurred for hundreds of years in Egypt, you have proof of a connection. And let me close by saying one of the questions that has been raised is, okay, how could it be possible? How could Africans cross the Atlantic? Everybody has shown that the Europeans had superior ships. That's why they were able to come across the Atlantic. Africans only had dugouts. That is not true. That is not true. The sails that were used on the caravels of Columbus and Vespucci were not European sails. They were Arab Latin sails that had been used by Arabs and Africans and other oceans. The compass was not invented in Europe. It was brought into Europe by the Moors. The Africans and Arabs, it had been developed partly in Asia and partly in the Arab-African world and brought into Europe. It is not a European invention. The astrolabe, all the nautical instruments used on those ships came from outside Europe. Even the guns that Europe was to use to destroy our forefathers were not invented by Europeans. The gunpowder came out of Turkestan, China. It was brought into Europe by the Moors. And the first use of artillery in the world was the use of Muslims against the Indians. It appears in documents now from the Russians. You could see an Arabic manuscript illustrating this. All these things were stolen from us. It's not only in the Egyptian period, but in the Moorish period, when Africans and Arabs introduced the first paved streets in Europe, the first lighted streets in Europe, when they introduced the first air conditioning in Europe, air conditioning that even has something to it which we rarely see here, perfumed air conditioning, they ran it over banks of flowers. They were the first to lead pipes from the mountains in Spain and run it into the houses. We never hear of that. We do not hear of the contribution of the African and the Arab to the Industrial Revolution. All we hear about is what happened after we were slaves. But when we first came here, we were not slaves. We came here and occupied positions of power, and we had an influence. The Native American and us stood side by side, as I have seen them now. When I go to give lectures in San Francisco, the audience is not just black. American Indians come to hear me. They beat their drums when I speak, because they know that they suffered as we did the destruction and twilight of their civilization, and they know that when the time comes and the drum is sounded again, and they are to recover the dignity and the strength and the wholeness, they will recover it side by side with us. They say we did not have boats. I'm going to close on this. I have shown that 120 experiments were made in boats crossing the Atlantic. The most famous is that by Thor Heyerdahl. Thor Heyerdahl had Africans rebuild a boat, the Ra-1, a papyrus reed boat, which Africans used before Christ. And in 1969, built by Abdullah de Jibrin and the Buduma people, it crossed the Atlantic safely and came all the way from Safi in North Africa right up into the Caribbean. This gives us clear evidence that we had the capacity to do it, that we had the civilization with elements ritual and technological which are repeated here, and also that our heads are here, sculptures representing our variety of people were here. The evidence is overwhelming. And I want to close by saying this type of thing can make a tremendous amount of difference to us all. As I always close my lectures by pointing out to you that what happened 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago is just as fresh, just as relevant, just as urgent, just as real as what happened 5 minutes ago, because it occupies the same time, space, and consciousness. Therefore, we must bear in mind that the prejudices that we suffer now, the kinds of stupidities, the blindnesses in our civilization, which are part of that false vision of history, can be repaired and redeemed by this new vision. It is a new vision that must change our lives. It must fill us with a new sense of pride and a new sense of strength, because it can bring a wholeness to a fragmented psyche, so that what was exploded and fragmented for centuries will now be healed and made whole again. Thank you very much.
All right. I enjoyed that. I know you did. All right. Dr. Van Sertima is on a tight schedule, brothers and sisters. So he's going to be right up here real short to answer some of your questions. The question and answer period is going to be a little abbreviated than that because of the fact that he has to leave kind of earlier than usual. But for those of you that have been here before, you know that this part of the program is something that
I wanted to know about the trip to Mexico. You were speaking that you were going to get a lecture out of Mexico.
Yes, I went 2 years ago with about 40 black Americans to Mexico. It is organized by Dorothy Anderson, who's here tonight. She's passed out forms, and could you stand up, Dorothy? Yes. You can get all your information from her. Her number, by the way, is 212-222-1642. 212-222-1642. She's organizing the trip, and we go to various cities in Mexico, various archaeological sites in Mexico, and I give lectures on the various sites. Yes. Yes. Okay, skin color is produced by pigmentation. In the beginnings of man being born in Africa, in the East African Rift Valley, it was necessary that he should be black, because the ultraviolet radiation in the tropics and equatorial regions is such that you must have pigmentation. Okay, so however, during the Ice Age, what is known as the worm interstadial, you could call it worm, period, W-U-R-M, worm, you have mutations occurring. You have, for example, the production at first perhaps of albinos. The black can give birth to a pigmentless type, that is a white type. It would have African features, but it would be white. A white person cannot give birth to a black person unless they have they have mixtures, but a black can give birth to a white. Okay, so that you have initially perhaps an albino type which has every element of the African but does not have pigment. The pigmentation or lack of pigmentation affects hair color, it affects eye color, it affects skin color. Okay, in the situation where you have long periods, like for about 10,000 years, where there is no sun, the sun is tangential, the sunlight is slanted, it is weak, it is thin, it is a twilight environment, you would have a tendency for pigmentation to be lost. This would begin by the melanocytes, which are active to protect you against ultraviolet radiation. Those would begin to get weaker and weaker until you would find them becoming inactive. As soon as you approach inactive melanocytes, you approach albinism. That is the movement from pigmented to pigmentless. It's a superficial change, but it's a change that occurs after thousands of years in the ice. Okay, that affected hair color, skin color, eye color. Okay, texture of hair has to do with wetness and dryness. That is a different feature. Okay, but the question of coloration, that has to do with pigmentation, pigmented and pigmentless. Okay, we are approaching another stage in the world where that pigmentation again becomes necessary. I was in the astrophysical laboratory at NASA some years ago and discovered that because of the breakup of the ozone layer, people who do not have color have suffered 20% skin cancer within the last 10 years, 20% increase in skin cancer, because it will become necessary again in many zones, not only the equatorial zone, to have protection against ultraviolet radiation, because ultraviolet radiation on this planet has now begun to increase again. It is not only active. Almost all the people who live in South Africa, for example, 25% of the people, white people who live in South Africa, parts of Australia, parts of the tropics, have skin cancer. No, this is not something to clap about. These are just the hard facts of a situation, ecological changes. These are ecological changes. So that I've answered your question. Okay.
To my knowledge, the Arabians have also enslaved the Africans.
Yes.
So why do you say that the Arabs claim that the Arabians and the Africans contributed to civilization?
Okay. The Arabians also enslaved the whites. In fact, the first slaves were white. In fact, the word slave comes from Slav. Okay, the Arabs first enslaved white people. Okay, many white women were made into concubines. They were enslaved. They were sold in various places, etc. White men were also sold, etc. At a certain period, Arabia was completely black. Then you have a Semitic type or an Asiatic type coming into Arabia. At the time of Muhammad, the majority of the Arabian type is a fair-skinned type. Okay, a Semitic, sometimes a Eurasian type, etc. This type then started to spread out in various parts of the world. Some of them were black, only a few of them were black. However, when they entered into Africa, they intermarried with African women and became black. When they attacked Spain, because the Moorish invasion was an attack into Spain and Portugal, you find the first troops that attacked Europe. Of 7,000 troops, 6,300 of them were black, 700 of them were fair-skinned Arabian types. Okay, then you have 4 dynasties in Europe that are black and Arabian. Okay, they are the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Almohade dynasty, and the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Almoravid dynasty, and the Almohade dynasty. The last 2 dynasties are mainly black. In other words, the last 2 dynasties are about 80 to 90% black, 10 to 20% Arabian. Okay, those dynasties which involved a mixing and fusion of Arab and African types contributed majorly to European civilization, because at that time, for example, you have at that time as much as in Europe only about 2 universities. The Muslims introduced 17 universities. The Muslims introduced various industries into Europe. They had all the major manuscripts translated from Persia, from Greece, from Egypt, from China, India, etc., brought into Europe, and Europe profited from these translations, because they had, the only thing that the Africans and Arabs insisted is that they have control in the election of bishops, but they did not interfere with the language, they did not interfere with the culture, they did not interfere with the fabric of European society, although it enriched it. Whereas when the Europeans eventually seized power, they then destroyed what they found. The Arabs, naturally, after Europe seized power, anything that was black and non-European became debased. Hence, everybody picked on the black. Okay, take the United Arab Republic of Egypt. At the debate in 1974, all the people who attacked Diop most viciously were the Egyptians, because they are not proper Egyptians. They came into Egypt in 640 AD. They're not Egyptian. The present Egyptian is not an Egyptian. It's just like the present American. There are no Americans in this room. Okay, the present American is not an American. That is why they want to be white, so that they got people like Galab, people like Abdullah, and those people who started attacking Diop. I mean, they're from the United Arab Republic, so that you have to understand there are different types of Arabs. For example, take Gaddafi. Gaddafi read my book, and when he made a broadcast to the Nation of Islam, he pointed out that it has been shown that the Africans have as much claim, far greater claim to America than the Europeans, because they were here with the Native Americans. Okay, so that you have to make a distinction. You can't just say, well, because the Arabs enslaved Africans, they didn't make contributions to civilization. Okay, the Europeans made contributions to civilization. What one is saying is that the African contribution is very important. It is major, and it was to affect and shape and considerably alter both Asiatic, European, and American civilization. Okay. We have about 3 minutes left for questions. Okay.
Okay, my question is 2 parts, and I would like to make the association.
If you could come closer to the mic. Yes, okay.
I would like to make an association, because I'm a Bible reader, so I have Bible history versus what I'm listening to from you. You said 50,000 years ago, Caucasian men.
That is the breakaway from we have carbon amino acid dating, which establishes that in Classes River mouth and at Omo in Ethiopian, Classes River mouth in South Africa, that Homo sapiens sapiens, the last species of man, which we are in, the phase in which we are in, is the African, and he has been dated 90,000 years, and he moves into, he starts to move out until he enters Europe and parts of Asia. Yes.
The connection that I want to make is, I want to find.
It's like 2 o'clock. The shorty just hit my line. She gon' slide. Yeah, she knows she in for a night. I'm like, give it with the bowl. It's that shit that touch the soul. She like her head on my chest cause she say that my ice is cold.